Okay, so welcome to Eat, Move, Think, the show about optimal wellness brought to you by Medcan.
Wow. Do it again.
Oh, I was practicing.
Okay, ready?
Welcome
to
Eat, Move, Think,
the show about
Optimal
wellness.
brought to you by
Medcan.
Yeah, this is extremely good. Thank you.
This episode is an encore presentation of our interview with Leslie Beck, Medcan's Director of Food and Nutrition and Intermittent Fasting Researcher and Nutrition Professor at the University of Illinois Chicago, Dr. Krista Varady. This interview first aired on April 4th, 2022.
Have you ever intermittent fasted?
I mean, I think probably by accident, because often I don't actually end up eating anything until maybe late afternoon. Is that what you're talking about?
Sort of.
Okay.
I mean, I think people are more intentional about it. So intermittent fasting is this really popular way to, I think, engage in weight loss or pursue weight loss and have all these other sorts of health benefits without actually counting calories or
Right.
paying much attention to actually what you're eating.
Oh my gosh, that's like the worst part of diets, is that you have to list every single thing you've consumed in that day. Like who does that?
Well, so the trade-off is you have to fast, though. You have to go without food for long periods. That's what intermittent fasting is. It's compressing your eating into a short period of time, either in a day or a week, and fasting the rest of the time.
So while you're losing this weight, are you just always grumpy? Because I mean, personally, like my first sign that I need to eat something is when I start, maybe getting a little upset at the people. Yeah, I get hangry. Like, don't even look at me that way.
I thought so too, but apparently a new research review published in the journal Nature Reviews Endocrinology suggests that you might experience headaches in the first couple of weeks, but then people report having a better ability to concentrate and feeling more energetic. I'm Chris Shulgin. I'm executive producer of Eat, Move, Think.
I'm Jasmine Ratch. I'm managing producer.
Welcome to the latest episode of the podcast. And our show today features a conversation between our Eat host, Leslie Beck, the Director of Food and Nutrition at Medcan, and Dr. Krista Varady, the world authority on a form of intermittent fasting called alternate day fasting. Dr. Varady is a professor of nutrition at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Her research focuses on the efficacy of intermittent fasting for weight loss and metabolic disease reduction in people with obesity. She's also the author of a book for the general public entitled The Every Other Day Diet. She's also the lead author of that recent Nature Reviews Endocrinology review of the science behind the 3 most popular forms of intermittent fasting. Today, Leslie talks to her about the benefits and disadvantages of intermittent fasting, its effectiveness for weight loss, and gets Dr. Varady's advice for people wanting to give it a try. Let's do it. Here's Leslie Beck.
Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Dr. Varady. I'm really excited to talk to you about intermittent fasting. It's certainly a topic I get lots of questions about from my clients, but welcome. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on today.
So your research has really focused on the effectiveness of intermittent fasting for weight loss and for metabolic disease reduction. I've read you have over 100 papers published on the topic. How did you become interested in intermittent fasting?
I started studying this during my postdoc at UC Berkeley. And initially, I was actually running studies of like calorie restriction because I was trying to help people with, just general weight loss. And I noticed people were really struggling with daily restriction regimens because they had to basically like record stuff in an app every day or in a food record. And people just get really burnt out of constantly having to record calorie intake. So I thought, well, do people really have to diet every day to lose weight? Or could we maybe, have some kind of more like a fasting approach or something where there's like a day of kind of intense calorie restriction followed by a day where people can kind of do whatever they want. So it kind of stemmed from that. And that's how I started studying alternate day fasting to begin with.
And intermittent fasting really has become a popular way to lose weight. I mean, it has been for a few years. Why is it so popular right now?
I think it's just like the sheer simplicity of the diet that people really love. Again, like they don't need to track energy, like any like calorie intake, or carbs or anything like that. I think it's also, if we look back at all the other fad diets that happened over the past 20 or 30 years with low fat diets or low carbohydrate diets, there was always this emphasis on like, not only tracking calories, but also tracking like carb intake. And it was just so complicated for people. So this one is like a totally different approach where instead of focusing on like those macronutrients like carbs and fat, we're really just focusing on meal timing, which is, if you have access to like the time, you can basically do this diet. So it's like really accessible. I think people love that about it. They love the fact that the diet allows you to eat freely during certain periods of the day or on certain days of the week. It's great that you can like combine these diets with other diets if you really want. And you don't have to buy like expensive products to do any of these diets. Like again, any of the like low carb or high protein kind of products that you need to buy.
Or keto.
So I think all of that is really I think people just honestly got burnt out of like doing all the keto and the carb diet. So they were like, oh, what's something simpler that we can do? So I think that's why people really like it.
Yeah, and perhaps sustainable as well. I mean, how sustainable is it for people to completely give up fruits and, grains when you're cutting carbs? So intermittent fasting, as you said, it's less about what we eat. It's more about when we eat. And I think many people out there, when they hear the words intermittent fasting, they think of time-restricted eating. So eating within a certain window, which is one form. But I don't think that everyone is really familiar with other types of intermittent fasting. And I'm just wondering if you could walk us through the 3 most researched types of intermittent fasting and really how they differ from one another.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the first thing, because there's so many terms and definitions for intermittent fasting, people get really confused. So the first thing that I always like to point out is that intermittent fasting is an umbrella term for 3 major types of diets. The first one is alternate day fasting, and that's when people have basically a fast day where you consume either just water or about 500 to 600 calories as like a dinner usually, or maybe a lunch. And then that's alternated with a feast day where people can just truly eat whatever they want. Obviously, we, ask people to eat focus on a healthy diet still, but you don't have to track anything or worry about calories or carbs or anything. So alternate day fasting really just kind of flip flops between feasting and fasting. Feast day, fast day, feast day, fast day,
okay,
basically forever. And then the 5-2 diet is the second type. And that is kind of a spin-off of alternate day fasting where people have 2 of those fast days per week, and you can put those fast days wherever you want. Recommend putting them on the weekdays because those are easier. Weekends is that's when people like to go out and stuff like that. So it's much more difficult to adhere very closely to a fasting protocol on the weekends. And then there's 5 feast days per week. And then the most popular one I'd say in North America is time-restricted eating, as you mentioned. And that's really simple. You basically just eat within a certain window of time each day. And it's usually about 8 hours or so. So you'd pick, an 8-hour window, let's say. Most people tend to pick from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m. And really, at 12 p.m., you just start eating. You don't have to track anything. At 8 p.m., you stop. And then you just water fast. Or you can fast with black coffee or black tea until, your eating period starts again the next day.
Okay, that's great. So you recently published a review paper on the effectiveness of intermittent fasting for weight loss in the journal Nature Reviews Endocrinology, essentially a summary of the most up-to-date research we have so far. So here's the question I think people really want to know the answer to. Does intermittent fasting work? Does it really help people lose weight?
Oh, yeah, I'd say it definitely works. So I've been studying intermittent fasting for the past 15 years or so, and I'd say it definitely works for weight loss. What we found just reviewing all the research articles in the field is that it results in about 4 to 8% weight loss in about 3 months or so. So for a lot of people, that translates to anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds in about 3 months. People are able to maintain weight loss. There's a few kind of longer term studies showing that if you continue a modified form of these diets, so maybe with alternate day fasting, you would continue with 1 fast day per week, you can maintain the weight loss. And then with time restricted eating, you can also potentially, we're actually running a study right now for weight maintenance. You can like kind of widen your window. So say from 8 hours to 10 hours, and that may help people actually maintain weight loss.
I also read in your paper that after 12 weeks, there doesn't seem to be any further weight loss from intermittent fasting. Is that true?
That is true, yeah. And that happens with a lot of dietary interventions. I always tell when I'm giving like talks to clinicians or dietitians that if you put someone on a diet and if you don't see any weight loss in the first 3 months, it's probably not going to happen because that's like when the weight loss happens. So very typical with dietary interventions.
And the research also found that weight loss wasn't as pronounced with time-restricted eating compared to the 5-2 diet and alternate day fasting. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so what we're noticing is I'm running studies. We've done a lot of studies in alternate day fasting, and now we've kind of shifted towards time-restricted eating because it's so popular. We're noticing that it's basically about half the amount of weight loss with time-restricted eating. I'm not quite sure why it is. I think, well, it's probably just because it doesn't create as much of an energy deficit. Like these diets produce weight loss just because people are eating less. I don't think there's anything that magical about them. But I think, just the energy deficit is just not as pronounced with time-restricted eating as it is with alternate day fasting. But I do want to point out we're actually running the first long-term study of time-restricted eating. It's 12 months, and we're comparing that diet to calorie restriction. And we just want to see, like, whenever I give talks, I always say, alternate day fasting, you're going to lose a lot more weight with that diet, but it is harder to adhere to because you still have to count calories certain days of the week. Whereas time restricted eating, again, you just kind of like follow the clock with meal timing, and people just love it so much. We get so many fewer dropouts with our time restricted eating protocols. So I'm wondering if people, the weight loss is slower, but if they can stick to it longer, then maybe over the course of a year, they're going to lose more weight. So
I see.
Yeah, but we really, time restricted eating, what people always have to keep in mind, because I get tons of questions as well. There's only been research in humans like for the past 5 years. Like there's a total of like 20 clinical trials in that. So I get like so many complicated questions and I'm always like, oh, back it up. The longest trial to date is like 4 months, except for the one we're running right now.
Right.
So we're trying to figure it all out still.
Dr. Varady's 12-month clinical trial was published in July 2023 in the Annals of Internal Medicine. It found that limiting food intake to a specific time window was as effective as calorie counting for weight loss. Participants who intermittent fasted and participants who counted calories generally maintained the weight loss after their diets ended and lost 5% of their body weight over the course of a year, according to Dr. Varady. By the end of the year, the intermittent fasting group had consumed 425 fewer calories per day on average than the control group and lost about 10 more pounds. The calorie counting group, meanwhile, ate around 405 fewer calories per day than the control group and lost about 12 more pounds.
And so when it comes to weight loss, how does the weight loss from intermittent fasting compare to the weight loss from traditional diet? Let's just say, reducing your calorie intake by 500 or so each day. How do they compare? Is one superior?
That's a great question. Yeah. So they produce the same amount of weight loss. So intermittent fasting is pretty much, the same as calorie restriction for weight loss and for health benefits as well. Like when we ran a study in 2017 that was published in JAMA showing that both diets produced about 5 to 6% weight loss and had kind of similar metabolic benefits. We didn't see a ton of things change, but there's a slight reduction in like triglycerides and blood pressure and that type of thing. I don't think intermittent fasting is better. I get that question all the time. I just think it's another kind of like for dietitians, it's another like tool in their toolbox for people that, maybe don't like tracking calories every day. You can suggest this diet to them if they don't want to do like low carb or something like that.
Okay, great. So certainly alternate day fasting and the 5-2 diet, they're on par in terms of weight loss with daily calorie restriction.
Exactly.
So what is the reason that people do lose weight from intermittent fasting? Is it simply just a matter of eating fewer calories, or is there something else going on with the fasting part of it?
Yeah, so there's so many different answers on the internet, obviously, about this. But I think, after our labs probably run the most studies of intermittent fasting. I'd say with certainty, it's just because people are eating less food. Again, there's nothing magical about it. I think, these diets kind of just fool people into eating less, so then they lose weight. I know there's lots of stuff out there saying it's like ketosis and all this stuff, but honestly, with these types of protocols, people don't really get into full-blown ketosis. I don't think ketosis is the reason that they're losing weight with these protocols.
So I've read that with time-restricted eating, letting your body fast for 16 hours, and as a result, keeping your insulin levels low for a longer period of time allows your body to burn more fat. Is that true?
I don't believe there's been any studies showing that directly. That makes sense, like from a physiological standpoint, but a 16-hour fast isn't really that long. So there's a great study by Sachin Panda's group that was published in Cell Metabolism in 2015, where they tried to figure out what's the normal eating window. And they found that people eat usually within a 14-hour window per day. So with 8-hour, time restricted eating, we're basically just cutting out 6 hours. So it's not a huge difference. I think when ketosis and real kind of troughs and insulin levels come into play is when people are doing multiple day fasts, which is not what intermittent fasting is. Not that. Intermittent fasting is literally kind of extending fasting periods every day, but it's not fasting for 3 to 5 full days.
I'd like to talk for a minute just about muscle loss. It's said that 25% of weight loss with traditional calorie restriction comes from muscle. And of course, we can mitigate that somewhat by, adding some resistance training or extra protein in there. Does muscle loss occur with intermittent fasting?
Yeah, it does. So basically, when somebody loses weight with pretty much any dietary intervention, about 75% of the weight loss is as fat mass and about 25% is as lean mass, is just like what you were saying. So you see that with daily calorie restriction. And then we're also noticing pretty much the exact same thing in our studies of alternate day fasting and time restricted eating. We're getting that kind of 25 to 75% ratio as well.
Okay. There was an intermittent fasting trial published in 2020. I'm sure you're very aware of it. It was conducted by researchers from the University of California in San Francisco. Actually, in fact, one of the researchers, Dr. Ethan Weiss, was a guest for this podcast. He talked about this study. And the findings seemed to hint that time-restricted eating, that 12 noon to 8 p.m. kind of window, might cause people to lose more muscle than traditional dieting. Why might that be?
I know what study you're talking about. That study got a lot of media attention because it was published in JAMA. But interestingly, we ran that exact same study 3 years before that and did not find those findings at all. That was an 8-hour time-restricted eating intervention that was run for 3 months. And that, I believe they found very little weight loss.
Right, 2 pounds.
Yeah. And then I think half of the weight loss was lean mass. But from looking at that paper more carefully, I think they had some issues. They measured it with DEXA, which is that basically that bone scanner, or I guess
bone density.
Yeah, bone density scanner. And that's really affected by hydration status. And from what I understand, they did control for that before taking the DEXA scans. I could have that wrong, but I believe I read that in their discussion section. If you're not controlling for how much water somebody drank, if they have more water intake, that can basically mess up the lean mass findings. But I do have to say, I know that study got a lot of media attention, but there's not many other studies supporting that hasn't been reproduced. So
okay.
I'm really excited to finally publish our paper, in the fall, because I can tell you with certainty now that we're not seeing those things after 12 months of the same, basically the exact same protocol.
Oh, that's great. That's good. Your research summary that was just published also looked at how effective intermittent fasting was for lowering blood cholesterol and blood pressure. What does the evidence say?
Yeah, so it also, not only does it produce weight loss, but it can definitely help with lowering cholesterol levels and blood pressure as well. So the different types of protocols have been shown to lower LDL cholesterol, so that bad cholesterol, by anywhere from about 10 to 25%. And then blood pressure, we also see pretty consistent reductions in, it's mainly systolic blood pressure. That one is usually more affected by diet therapies. And that usually goes down anywhere from 10 to 15% with most of these diets.
And again, it would be in people who have high blood pressure to begin with, or elevated LDL cholesterol to begin with, I assume.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, we definitely see far more pronounced effects in people that start with like high LDL and high blood pressure.
Something I'm intrigued about is early time restricted eating or circadian rhythm fasting. I'm wondering if we can talk about that a little bit. Do you think it may have health advantages over the way most people do time restricted eating? They skip breakfast and they start eating at lunch?
Oh, yeah. Another great question. So early time restricted eating is basically when people try to consume all their food before 3 p.m. Well, that's in like scientific studies, that's how they classify it. And I do think that there is a benefit to early time restricted eating because basically our bodies are a lot more insulin sensitive in the morning. Our body can basically process nutrients and glucose really well right when we wake up. And then our ability to like put away glucose kind of goes down throughout the course of the day. So if you're loading up, most of your food in the morning, that makes sense according to your circadian rhythm and that the fact that our insulin sensitivity is so much greater in the morning. But the problem is people do not want to do that. So
Right.
we notice if you can somehow, if your lifestyle, if you can stop eating by 3 p.m. every day, then yes, that's healthier. That's a healthier eating pattern.
Okay.
But most people will not do that. So in our studies, we've run a few other kind of pilot studies trying to get people to stop eating even by 5 p.m. And we had like very, very high dropout rates. People just can't do it because, it really upsets people's social schedules. Like, eating is such a social thing. So if you design a study where people can't eat with their families or, socialize after work or whatever it is, they're not going to follow those diets. We've definitely had certain subjects where we had our initial alternate day fasting studies on the fast day. We actually used to put the meal as a lunch. And we had so many complaints about that. Just there were so many people in our studies that were like making dinner at home for their family, and then they could, because it was their fast day, they would just have to like sit there and drink tea while the meal that they had just made was being consumed by their family. And they said it was just like torturous. So, I think, long answer short is it's healthier to eat earlier, but it's also far less feasible.
Yeah, just not practical. Okay. What side effects then can people expect if they decide to incorporate intermittent fasting into their lifestyle?
So the diet's generally safe. In general, the only thing that we really see in the first 10 days is an increase in headaches. And that tends to happen because people aren't consuming enough water. When you're fasting, you're consuming less food. And then just by way of consuming less food, you end up consuming less water just because there's like literally a lot of water in the foods. So we always tell people, make sure you really up your water intake. Other concerns that people have with intermittent fasting is the effect on metabolism. So people are always worried that it will tank their metabolism.
Because?
Yeah, the reason that they think that is because, well, actually, there's so much concern about it, but I think a lot of people don't understand that their metabolism, which literally translates into their metabolic rate, 85% of it's dictated by your lean mass, so your muscle mass. Mm-hmm. So as a person loses weight, as I mentioned before, a part of that, about 25% of that weight loss is lean mass. And as you lose lean mass, your metabolic rate's going to go down. But basically, we see the same kind of minor drops in metabolism with daily calorie restriction, so like regular dieting, as we see with intermittent fasting. So there's no, fasting doesn't tank your metabolism while regular dieting has no effect. Like, I think that's the general belief, but that's completely untrue. So it basically does the same thing as any other diet would. So to put that in practical terms, people's metabolism goes down by about 100 or 200 calories if they lose like 10 to 20 pounds or so.
Okay. Some people, though, get cranky and irritable, and they are less able to concentrate when they go without food too long. Just normal day, not even dieting. Does your research show that this is the case for intermittent fasters?
So no, we actually find that people actually have like a boost of energy on fast days. Well, I do have to point out the first 10 days are a little rough. I'm not going to lie. But in all of our studies, with time restricted feeding and alternate day fasting, there is that adjustment period. Like our bodies do take a few days to kind of adapt to like a new pattern of eating. But once people are past that, they actually feel great. And a lot of people have said that they actually have a boost of energy during a fasting period. And I think I mentioned it in the article, but basically this might be linked to some type of evolutionary thing where if we don't have food, our bodies will give us energy to go out into our environment and find food potentially. So maybe that's what it's from, but you don't have to worry. You're not going to feel, terrible while you're fasting the whole time. The first couple days, and then after that, people feel great.
And does fasting impact a person's ability to work out? Can they continue their usual workout routine? I suppose perhaps it might be a little more difficult during the first 10 days. What do participants usually find?
So yeah, we found that people can definitely just continue their regular exercise routine with intermittent fasting. We've done studies where we've combined. Well, we just finished one actually where we combined exercise with alternate day fasting, and found that people actually chose to exercise on their fast days just as frequently as they did on their feast days. So they weren't like scared of exercising on a fasting day, and they found that they had energy to do so.
That's great. So when people are doing intermittent fasting, whether they're doing alternate day fasting, the 5-2 diet, or time-restricted eating, they're eating less food. What does the research show around people's nutrient intakes? Are they low on any nutrient because they're doing intermittent fasting? Are they missing out on anything?
Yeah, so there was definitely some concern, and I think I did mention it in the article. From like a study standpoint, we look at from food records whether or not people are consuming adequate amounts of like all the macronutrients and micronutrients, and we haven't seen any deficiencies from a food record standpoint. But I do have to say we haven't measured it like in the blood, which is like the real way to, there's different ways to measure nutrients. One of the things though that comes up, I'd say more often with kind of like diet quality and intermittent fasting is people are often concerned that with time restricted eating with like smaller windows. So we've run studies of like 4 hours and 6-hour eating windows. There's a lot of concern in the medical community that people would be eating like a really poor diet because they'd be so hungry. If you're like fasting for 20 hours and your 4-hour window starts, are you going to reach for like some super high energy dense, high sugar food? And so we did a nutrition analysis in that study and found that people actually just ate the same way they were eating before. So they weren't eating like poor diet quality in smaller eating windows, or even like within the 8-hour window, they were still choosing the same foods. I wouldn't say they're healthy foods. I think you're a dietitian, right?
I am.
I'm not a dietitian, but I did do a degree. My bachelor's degree is in dietetics, and it's really hard to get people to change the types of food they're eating. We've run like thousands of people through these intermittent fasting interventions, and we always give dietary counseling weekly one-on-one, and we're just trying to get them to eat a couple more fruits and vegetables, up their fiber intake, and it just never works. So it doesn't get worse, but it doesn't get better, I'd say.
One thing you did mention in the paper that was just published is that intermittent fasters tend to have low fiber intakes. And I think that was a piece of advice you gave towards the end of the paper, is just to really be including whole grains, fruits and vegetables on a daily basis. Well, when you're eating, I should say, to keep your fiber intake up. Is that something that's, you generally find with intermittent fasting?
So what I found just looking at like the NHANES data, which is like just what people eat in America, basically, I'd say pretty much everyone has really low fiber intake. I think it's around 12. Yeah, I think it's about 12 grams per day. I think the latest one was saying, and we're supposed to be consuming around 25 grams. So in general, people are eating about half as much of the fiber as they should be. But definitely on fast days, we're noticing the fiber, just because they're only consuming like 500 calories, they're probably eating more like 5 to 6 grams of fiber. So that could be an issue. But at the same time, though, we haven't noticed like increases in constipation or anything like that. So I'm not quite sure if it's having that many negative effects.
So really what we're talking about in terms of side effects for starting out on intermittent fasting is if you don't increase your water intake, you could expect to perhaps experience headaches early on.
Exactly, yes.
So who should not try intermittent fasting?
So yeah, and this is something that we've definitely put in the article just to clearly outline it. So there's several groups that should not do intermittent fasting. Children under 12, for instance, there's no, I just don't think those children are growing. They should not be probably calorie restricting or intermittent fasting. Women who are pregnant or lactating, there's no safety data around that. So it's probably not recommended for them at this point. People with a history of eating disorders, particularly binge eating disorders, those individuals don't tend to do well with alternate day fasting. They tend to binge on the feast days, whereas an average person just doesn't binge on the feast days. People with a BMI basically less than 18.5 kilograms per meter square. So that would be people that are underweight should not do it. And then there's also really not that many studies in people over 70 years old. And, when somebody hits 70, their lean mass starts to go down quite a bit. So I probably wouldn't recommend it for them just because we don't want to exacerbate like sarcopenia or like that muscle mass loss.
So as a dietitian, what I really appreciated about your recent paper, Nature Reviews, was that you did offer practical advice for people who want to perhaps dabble their toes in intermittent fasting. So from a nutrition perspective, a diet perspective, what would you advise people who are starting intermittent fasting to think about with respect to their diet?
Whenever people start, I would definitely say that there is that adjustment period, just because we do get dropouts in our studies in that first week because people are like, oh, this is too hard. But just keep in mind that it does get easier after about 10 days. And just remember to obviously drink water so you can avoid getting those headaches that some people get in the first little while. We always say to emphasize fruits and vegetables. We definitely, fasting will help people lower their calorie intake, but, the quality of your diet's also really important. That can help prevent chronic diseases long term. So we always try to have people, more fruits and vegetables, whole grains to boost fiber and micronutrient intake. Another kind of practical tip if somebody wants to start alternate day fasting is we ask that they try to consume about 50 grams of lean protein on the fast day. That kind of helps people maintain muscle mass a bit. And then also it can help lower hunger and like cravings and stuff like that. And then I also get questions about like beverages. So alcohol is permitted in moderation during intermittent fasting. It's not like you have to stop drinking alcohol completely. During alternate day fasting, I wouldn't recommend it on the fast day. Like alcohol is a lot of calories, so you don't want it to count towards your like 500 calories on the fast day. But on the feast day, you can, we ask people to basically follow the nutrition guidelines, which is like 1 drink per day for women and then 2 drinks per day for men. And then with time restricted eating, definitely during your eating window, it's fine to have like a glass of wine, that type of thing. And then in terms of other beverages, like during the fasting period, we often recommend like black coffee, black tea. I get a lot of questions about like, can I put some cream in my coffee? If you're not overdoing it, sure, it's fine. It's basically, you're just trying to create a calorie deficit, honestly. So if you put a little bit of cream in there, I don't think it's really that big of a deal. But I would definitely, monitor how much you're putting in over the course of your fasting period if you're drinking a lot of coffee. I also get questions about like diet soda. We do permit those in our trials. We allow people to have about 2 per day during the fasting period, but no more than that because there's studies showing that it can increase sugar cravings. So we don't want people to get hungry from, drinking too many diet sodas.
And I'm often asked by clients who are doing time-restricted eating in that fast period, is there a maximum number of calories they consume for things like the cream in their coffee or something else? And it's interesting that you say basically what we're doing at the end of the day is nothing more than creating a calorie deficit.
Yeah, I believe that. I go to these fasting conferences and some of my like colleagues really, they really believe in like ketosis and then like autophagy. I don't know if you want to get into any of that, but the thing with autophagy, which basically just means like self-eating. So there's this thing with fasting where people believe that if they prolong their fasting period, and this is true, this has been shown in like rodents, but we can't measure this in humans yet, so we really have no idea what's going on. But it's kind of this beautiful mechanism where when you basically don't eat for a while, your body has a chance to like look inward on itself and basically clean itself up. So there's certain cell components and stuff that will get degraded by the body, cell components that like aren't working that well.
Right.
So some people believe like in all these different mechanisms of fasting, and you'll definitely see them all over the internet. But really, I think the main one that I've just learned or that I see consistently in our studies is just people are just eating less. They're eating about 300 to 500 calories less per day. So they're losing like a pound a week or so.
So we don't have long-term data on the efficacy or the safety of intermittent fasting. Do we know anything about the effects of doing fasting for years?
We don't from a scientific standpoint, no. So the only kind of like anecdotal evidence I have is I get these like really nice emails from people, probably like almost weekly at this point, saying like, oh, I've actually, thanks for studying this. I've been doing intermittent fasting for 15 years and I lost like whatever 50 pounds or something to begin with. And I've kept the weight off, like following these diets regularly. And, some people have even reversed their type 2 diabetes. But this is all anecdotal evidence, but it all lends itself towards, showing that maybe if people do these diets long term, that they can really help people, improve their health, which is amazing.
Which is great. So you've got a few studies in the works, one a 12-month study. That's fantastic. Any other books planned besides the every other day diet?
No books planned just yet that are firmly planned, but we do have a couple studies that have one study just finished up actually last week looking at fatty liver disease. And so we're seeing some really promising findings that alternate day fasting combined with exercise can actually help basically almost reverse fatty liver disease. So we're hoping to publish that this summer. And then, that type 2 diabetes study, I'm so excited. We just started that one. So that will be the first study of time restricted eating in that population group.
The study Dr. Varady is talking about here was published in January 2023 in Cell Metabolism, and it found that after a 3-month randomized control trial, liver fat was reduced by 5.5% in the group that participated in both alternate day fasting and exercise, compared to the group that only exercised, which saw a 1.3% reduction in liver fat. The group that fasted and exercised also had a 5% reduction in body weight, fat mass, waist circumference, and liver enzyme levels and increases in insulin sensitivity, indicating better blood sugar control.
So, Dr. Varady, what is your personal experience with intermittent fasting?
I've been pretty fortunate to be basically like normal weight all my life and fairly healthy. So I've used intermittent fasting a couple different times. I have 2 children, so I've used alternate day fasting after my pregnancies to lose that 15 pounds or so of weight. And it really worked well. And then I regularly just stop eating after dinner. So I've kind of always done that. When I started reading the research, finding out that, our basically at night, we have our insulin resistance just skyrockets. That really freaked me out. So I stopped eating after dinner time because, sometimes I would like to snack, but I rarely do that.
And I think that's great advice for anyone, whether you intermittent fast or not. Don't snack after dinner.
Exactly. And then you can cut out so many extra calories too. And So
this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Varady, for taking the time to share your expertise with us on the show. It's really been great. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me here. I really enjoyed all the questions and it's been wonderful talking with you.
That was our host and Medcan Director of Food and Nutrition, Leslie Beck, in conversation with Dr. Krista Varady of the University of Illinois, Chicago.
Remember to rate and subscribe to Eat, Move, Think on your favorite podcast platform. Follow our guest host, Leslie Beck, on Twitter at LeslieBeckRD and Dr. Krista Varady on Instagram at Dr. Krista Varady. And lastly, Medcan on Twitter and Instagram at MedcanLibWell.
We'll post episode highlights and links you can visit on our website, eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Say hello and send us a tip or a suggestion by emailing us at info@eatmovethinkpodcast.com.
Eat Move Think is produced by Ghost Bureau. Senior producer is Russell Gregg. Jasmine Ratch is managing producer.
Social media and strategy support is from Chantel Gertin and Andrew Imex. Executive producer is Christopher Shulgin.
We'll be back soon with a new episode examining the latest in health and wellness.
This podcast episode is intended to provide general information about health and wellness only and is not designed or intended to constitute or be used as a substitute for medical advice, treatment, or diagnosis. You should always talk to your Medcan healthcare provider for individual medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment, including your specific health and wellness needs. This podcast is based on the information available at the time of preparation and is only accurate and current as of that date. Source information and recommendations are subject to change based on scientific evidence as it evolves over time. Medcan is not responsible for future changes or updates to the information and recommendations and assumes no obligation to update based on future developments. Reference to or mention of specific treatments or therapies does not constitute or imply a recommendation or endorsement. The links provided within the associated document are to assist the reader with any specific information highlighted. Any third-party links are not endorsed by Medcan.